Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alexander Scott. I am your host and outreach coordinator here at Latin American Perspectives. Today, we have a very cool and interesting podcast prepared for you that covers our new May LAP issue titled Israel, Palestine, and Latin America, Conflictual Relationships. Although I had a general understanding of the historic relationship between Israel, Palestine, and Latin America, my conversation with the issue's co-editor, Pablo Pozzi, has been incredibly informative and made me just aware of how little I actually knew about this history, as well as how relevant the topic is in the contemporary moment. In addition to being a regular contributor to LAP, Pablo is a full professor of history at the Universidad de Buenos Aires, where he holds the chair in United States history and teaches the dissertation seminar on Argentine labor. Among his published works are La Oposición Obrera a la Dictadura, 1976 through 1982, published in 1988, Los Setentistas, Izquierda y Clase Obrera, 1969 through 1976, published in 2000, and Por las Sendas Argentinas, El PRT entre ERP, La Guerra Marxista, published in 2001. Unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, the beginning of my conversation with Pablo was cut off, and the present recording picks up a few minutes into our conversation. Hope you enjoy it. Okay.
I got him right here.
Okay, excellent. So would you briefly summarize for our listeners the main theme of the issue and provide some background information on how the issue came about?
The issue came about basically because of a really interesting and complicated debate we had in Latin American Perspectives a few years back. 6 of us in the collective essentially posited that Latin American Perspective should support the BDS movement in terms of boycott. Our position was not a question of anti-Israel, but a question of having Israel respect human rights of the Palestinian population there. This set off a long debate with different members of Latin American Perspectives. As usual, some got annoyed, some didn't get annoyed, but we all tried to find some sort of a compromise that would permit us to both respect each other's ideas, which was a crucial thing, I think, and at the same time go on working together. The result was to propose an issue of Latin American Perspectives dealing with the Arab and Jewish communities, specifically the Palestinians in Latin America. And we wanted to deal with it in terms of both its history and its politics and its relationship to Israel.
For me, prior to reading your introduction to the issue, I was aware of Arab and Jewish communities in Latin America, but to be honest, I was pretty ignorant to the historic connection between Latin America and Arab and Jewish communities, and just the history of migration from those regions to Latin America. So could you describe the historic connection between Latin America and the Arab and Jewish communities? And in particular, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the history of migration to Latin America.
In terms of both Arab and Jewish communities in Latin America, the big thing I believe is that, first of all, they're not homogeneous. Arabs, there's 2 different waves. One in terms of those coming around 1900, most of them came from Syria and Lebanon, and some from Palestine and Egypt. Most of them were not Muslims. They were Copts, they were Maronites, they were different Christians. The Muslim migration to Latin America came later on, literally after the 1960s, and especially in the 80s and 90s. They tended that there's more Palestinian migration, and then the first one, though there's Palestinians in both. In terms of social sectors and areas where they came, many of them settled in Brazil, some in quite a few in Argentina and in Chile, and many of them were either workers or very small businessmen, what you call petty bourgeois. In terms of the Jewish communities, you have also different waves and different areas. The first bunches of these people were some people dealing with commerce who went to places like Mexico and Argentina. And then you had, by the 1880s, 1890s, a larger Jewish migration, many of them from Galicia, from the Russian Empire, which in terms meant that in Argentina, Jews are called Russians, just like the Arabs are called Turks, which is, and the Lebanese are called Syrian Lebanese. In other words, it has, the terms have little relationship to the realities of these people. The migrations were, the Jewish migration came through two different waves. One was people who were escaping anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire and in Europe in general. And then there was a whole colonization project linked to to a man called the Baron Hirsch, who brought Jewish peasants, really, to settle in a whole series of areas along uh, the rivers Paraná and in the Entre Rio province and the Uruguay River. And they have townships that were set up and were for quite a while very successful in those terms. These people were called the Jewish gauchos as a whole. These were added also to different Jewish institutions who also brought migrants, immigrants to Latin America, specifically to Argentina and Brazil. Some were the Socialist Bund, and very few were Zionists. Not many of these communities were Zionists to begin with. Actually, many of them were non-practicing Jews. Many of them were working class. Many of them, especially by the 1920s, 1930s, were committed anti-fascists. That meant that, for instance, the socialists and communists in Latin America had quite a number of Jews in them. It meant also that the different dictatorships tended to equate Judaism and communism and consider it that there was a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy to take over America. This also meant that basically the relationship between the communities and integration into the Latin American communities was very significant in terms of class considerations, let's say. The world workers, as opposed to being Jewish workers or Catholic workers or white workers or Arab workers. This meant basically that in Argentina, for instance, there had been very few pogroms. The best known one was in 1919, after a huge strike called the Tragic Week, La Semana Trágica. It was a working class strike, obviously. And the children of the rich, the adolescent children of the rich in Buenos Aires City went out to hunt Russians, which meant basically they went into heavily Jewish neighborhoods to beat up and sometimes kill people as a whole. There were a couple of other pogroms in Argentine history, basically fostered in the provinces in the south, in Tandil, through landowners, because many of the Jewish peasants in the area, campesinos, were linked to anarchism, socialism, and communism and wanted things like land reform. But comparatively to other areas, it was a fairly low level of anti Semitism as a whole. Anti Semitic groups have been in the minority in most of Latin America, with the exception of places like Mexico, where Jews were considered part of the rich community, and so it was anti-Semitism was conflated with class discrimination. Okay, between the relationship between Arab and Jewish communities throughout most of the 20th century was reasonably acceptable. I mean, by reasonably acceptable, I mean there's no level of conflict that's registered between them, though intermingling was not very high either.
In the introduction, you and Ronaldo, I think, importantly describe the really significant role Latin American countries played in the creation of the State of Israel, as well
Sure.
as the historic relationship between various authoritarian governments in Latin America and Israel throughout the latter 20th century. Could you share some information about this history for our listeners?
Sure. Latin American countries were heavily supportive of Israel, of the creation of Israel. All Latin American countries, but one in the UN, voted to create Israel. Essentially, their project at the time, or at least what they sought, was a refuge for Jewish people persecuted from the Holocaust, that they had the right to have a place of their own. At the same time, the basic idea was uh, that they would share the region with the non Jewish population there. I mean, it was not a project of, the vote did not imply an exclusively Jewish state, though it did imply a state where the Jews would have rights, protection, and a whole bunch of other things. There was a debate at the time whether to create it in Palestine or in Patagonia, and for obvious reasons, especially Zionist lobbying, Palestine basically won out, so basically also because it had a significant migration of Jewish people in the area to begin with. As a whole, let's say in the 40s and 50s, my impression is that most governments and the population of Latin America was supportive of Israel, and that this begins changing once what could be termed ethnic cleansing of local Palestinians began being known. And then after the 1967 war, this became even more complicated after the 1990s in terms of lots of information arriving of what is a very harsh Israeli government policies towards Palestinians in general. At the same time, part of the problem has been that the Israeli government has been supportive and has had different treaties and agreements with Latin American dictatorships. It is quite well known that Israel trained, armed, and gave support to paramilitary death squads from Guatemala to the Nicaraguan Contra, all the way down south uh, to Argentina and Chile. This is interesting considering that many of those dictatorships were heavily anti Semitic themselves. But I assume foreign policy has its own logic and reasoning. This meant that, for instance, in terms of the disappeared in Argentina, the Israeli government did not denounce or take a firm stand, though it did have a policy of trying to save and bringing Jews who were persecuted in Argentina to bring them to Israel. It's been a very conflictive relationship, and it has gotten worse as time goes by. Many of those nations who supported the creation of Israel have been very critical, very, very critical of Israeli policies towards Palestinians over the past 20 years.
With that in mind, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the current state of the BDS movement in Latin America and how social movements or organizations are organizing around this issue.
Well, BDS has been growing significantly in Latin America over the past 10, 15 years or so. Many universities have supported BDS and taken up their stance. Most student movements in the Southern Cone specifically have been supporters of BDS as a whole. In general, like I said, the public opinion is heavily critical of Israeli policy, not which is not considered the same thing as being critical of Israel and its existence itself. I believe that public opinion down here would heavily support some sort of a negotiated settlement, and the impression that we get is that the Israeli government is not willing to negotiate at all anything. As such, BDS definitely grows. It's seen as a form of non-violent resistance to express your disagreement against policies which are wrong, clearly wrong. One of the main problems for Israel with Latin American BDS is that many Latin American Jews support BDS. The issue, let's say, with friends of mine, the things we have discussed is that Israel has violated basic tenets and criteria of Jewishness. They would say this is not what being Jewish is about. We were persecuted for thousands of years. We should not be persecuting other people just for their race or ethnicity or creed. Complicated, but it is growing significantly. Places like Argentina and Chile, Brazil, BDS is a fairly strong movement.
So you mentioned in the issue as well that the most recent flashpoint for Israeli Latin American relations has been the question of Iran
Yep.
and the country's right to develop a nuclear program. So I'm curious, what's the current state of relations between Latin American countries and the state of Israel and Iran? And have there been any recent developments on this issue?
God in heavens, there's 20 and some odd Latin American countries. I think we don't take a united stand on just about anything, even less
Of course.
on Iran. Um, I can speak there perhaps for some of these countries, which I more or less know. It deals with a couple of different things. One is the issue of nuclear power. Many Latin Americans are very critical of the United States and other major powers, including Israel, having a monopoly on nuclear power. And I'm not speaking of nuclear power only in terms of military applications, but also in terms of energy and development. What they feel basically is that the monopoly of this power is an issue of impinges that of trying to limit uh, the development, social and economic development of different Latin American countries. As such, uh, the question of U.S. pressure on Argentina in the 1980s to end its nuclear program, nuclear research program, not military research program, strikes a strong chord when they hear that the same kind of pressure is put on Iran. There's sympathy for the Iranians and their desire to both protect and develop their society. This gets more complicated in turn. Let me put it this way. This is fairly simple. When the Iranians say that they have complied with the Atomic Energy Commission's surveillance of their sites and that they're not developing nuclear power for military reasons, we tend to believe them. We believe that American news agencies are not necessarily truthful. but are distorting possibly reality. This gets more complicated with the issues of the two bombings in Argentina, the first one in 92 of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, and the second one in 94 of the cultural center in Buenos Aires. Both bombings killed an awful lot of people. And we still don't know for certain who did it. According to the US government, let's say the FBI and the State Department and the Mossad, Israel's Mossad, they point to Iran and to Hezbollah as the author. Up to now, there seems to be no proof. Most proof that has been gathered down here is that the authors are, in terms of the cultural center, are people within the Argentine government, federal police in particular, intelligence services locally. Were they doing it because they were pro-Iran, or did they do? If they did it, did they do it because they're anti-Semite? We don't know. It's so complicated that we have no concrete data on that. In terms of the Israeli embassy, one of the themes pursued was that the explosion came from inside the embassy. Does that mean that there was a bomb planted from outside inside the embassy, or that the embassy had an arsenal within the building and that exploded? Again, we don't know. It's very complicated because it links issues of terrorism, questions of foreign policy interests, commercial treaties, Israeli pressure, US pressure, Iranian pressure, and various other things.
That's a great response.
I'm
That's
glad
about
you liked it. I'm not convinced myself, but okay.
But
Good.
thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and
My
perspectives on
pleasure.
this. It was great to talk with you. I look forward to reading your issue, and I don't know, hopefully we get to speak again sometime. Maybe you'll edit another issue.
Oh, I certainly hope we will.
Excellent.
Take good
Well,
care.
yeah, you too. Great to talk to you. Okay, folks. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. But how was that for a brief lesson on 20th century history and contemporary geopolitics in Latin America and the Middle East? I'm still trying to process and take in everything Pablo and I talked about. I imagine there's a lot we were unable to cover, but I hope it shed some light on this important and increasingly relevant issue. If you haven't already, please retweet or share this podcast with your radical colleagues and friends, and share your thoughts with us. Also, if you haven't already, please add us on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, YouTube, and all of your other wonderful social media sites. You can join us again in July for our next podcast, so keep an eye out for that. Hasta luego. Hasta luego. Hasta luego.